So what was a medieval bailiff? The simplest way to think about him is as a manager. He was the man in charge of a manor. But that simple answer hides a lot of complexity. To really get it, you have to understand what a manor was. Imagine a large piece of land, maybe a few thousand acres. This is the manor. It was the basic economic unit for much of the Middle Ages. On this land was a village where peasants lived. There were fields for growing crops, pastures for grazing animals, and woods for timber and hunting. There might be a manor house where the lord lived, a church, a mill for grinding grain, and a blacksmith shop. A manor was its own little world. The person who owned this world was the lord. He might be a knight, a baron, or even a king, or a powerful monastery. The key thing is, this lord often owned more than one manor. A wealthy baron might own dozens of them, scattered all over the country. He couldn't be in all places at once. He was often away at court or at war or just living on his favorite largest estate. This is where the bailiff comes in. The lord needed someone on the ground at each manor to run the show for him. He needed a professional manager to make sure the land produced a profit. That manager was the bailiff. The bailiff was the lord's appointed representative. He was the lord's eyes, ears, and hands on that specific piece of land. The word itself tells you a lot. It comes from an old French word, bailler, which meant to entrust or to have charge of. A bailiff was someone entrusted with the care of something valuable. The area he managed was called his bailiwick. This is a word we still use sometimes today when we talk about someone's area of expertise. The bailiff was not a peasant. He was almost always a freeman. He might be a skilled farmer from another village, or maybe the younger son of a minor noble family with no land of his own. He was an employee. He had a contract and he was paid a salary. He also got perks, like living in a decent house on the manor and getting a share of the produce. His job depended entirely on his performance. If the manor failed to make money, the lord would fire him and find someone else. It's important not to confuse the bailiff with other officials on the manor. The most important of these was the reeve. The reeve was a peasant, one of the villagers. He was usually elected by the other peasants for a year. His job was to represent them, but also to organize their daily work. He was the foreman of the peasant workforce. So you had this interesting dynamic. The bailiff was the outside manager, appointed by the lord. The reeve was the inside foreman, chosen from the community. They had to work together every single day. The bailiff would decide what needed to be done, and the reeve would be responsible for getting the villagers to do it. As you can imagine, this relationship was full of potential for conflict. The bailiff's only goal was the lord's profit. The reeve had to balance that with the well-being and willingness of his friends and neighbors. There was also another figure, the steward. The steward was a much higher-ranking official. If a lord owned 20 manors, he would have one steward who traveled between them all. The steward was the lord's chief financial officer. He would visit each manor maybe once or twice a year to inspect the bailiff's work, go over the accounts, and hold the manor court. The bailiff answered to the steward. So, you have a clear chain of command, lord at the top, steward managing the portfolio, and the bailiff managing the day-to-day operations of a single manor. The bailiff's life revolved around one central question: how can this land make the most money for the lord? This meant maximizing the harvest from the lord's personal land, called the demesne. It meant making sure all the rents and fees were collected. It meant keeping expenses low. He was a businessman whose business was agriculture. He lived and worked in the same village as the peasants, but he was not one of them. He was a man in the middle, caught between the demands of the absent lord and the realities of life on the ground. A bailiff's job was never done. It followed the rhythm of the seasons, but every day brought new tasks and new problems. His work was a mix of agriculture, accounting, and managing people. He was constantly walking, watching, and directing. Let's start with the heart of the manor, the fields. The bailiff was the master planner of the agricultural year. In the spring, he decided which of the lord's fields would be planted with wheat or barley, and which would be planted with oats or beans. He also decided which field would lie fallow, letting it rest to regain its nutrients. This was a crucial decision that affected the manor's food supply and income for the entire year. Once the plan was made, he had to supervise the work. He watched the plowing teams to make sure they were plowing straight, deep furrows. A poorly plowed field meant a smaller harvest. He inspected the seed corn, ensuring only the best quality was used. He would tell the reeve how many villagers were needed for sowing and harrowing. He was always present, a constant, observant figure on the edge of the field. His job was not just about the lord's land. The peasants farmed their own small strips of land, but the bailiff still had a say. He had to ensure their farming practices didn't negatively affect the lord's land next to it. For example, if a peasant failed to weed his own strip, the weeds could spread into the lord's crop. The bailiff would fine him for it. Then there was labor management. The peasants, especially the unfree serfs or villains, owed the lord labor. This was called boon work or week work. They had to spend a certain number of days each week working on the lord's demesne for free. It was the bailiff's job to call them to work. He would tell the reeve, I need 10 men to repair the fence by the river tomorrow, or I need all the women and children for weeding on Wednesday. He had to keep track of who showed up and who didn't. If someone was sick, they might be excused. If someone was just lazy, they'd be in trouble. The bailiff was the one who enforced this system. He was the one who had to be the bad guy, chasing people up to make sure the lord got his free labor. This was a constant source of friction between him and the villagers. The most stressful time of year for the bailiff was the harvest. Everything depended on getting the crops in quickly and safely. A week of rain at the wrong time could ruin a year's profit. The bailiff was in a state of high alert. He would organize the entire village. Everyone, men, women, and children, would be out in the fields reaping with sickles. The bailiff would be there from sunrise to sunset, pushing them on, making sure no grain was wasted. He watched them closely to prevent theft. A few sheaves of wheat tucked away could mean a lot to a poor family, but to the bailiff, it was a loss for the lord. After the harvest came the accounting. The bailiff had to measure and record every single bushel of grain. It was stored in the Lord's Tithe barn, a massive structure built for this purpose. He had to decide how much would be kept to feed the Lord's household, how much would be kept as seed for next year, and how much would be sold at market. He was the one who would take the surplus grain to the nearest town and haggle for the best price. Beyond the fields, the bailiff managed all the lord's other assets. He was responsible for the livestock. He managed the breeding of the lord's oxen, horses, and sheep. He kept records of every animal. He knew which cow was the best milker and which ox was the strongest puller. If an animal got sick, he had to find a remedy or decide if it needed to be culled. He also oversaw maintenance. The manor was full of buildings and infrastructure that needed constant repair. The roof of the manor house might be leaking. The fences around the pastures might be broken. The village mill, which everyone had to pay to use, might have a broken grinding stone. The bailiff was responsible for hiring skilled labor, like carpenters or masons, or for organizing peasant labor to fix these problems. He had to manage the resources, making sure there was enough timber from the lord's woods or stone from the quarry. Every repair was an expense he had to justify. His day was a constant series of inspections and decisions. He would walk the fields, check the granary, count the sheep, look at the state of the mill, and listen to reports from the reeve. He was part farmer, part project manager, and part accountant. It was a difficult, demanding job that required a huge range of practical skills. The bailiff lived in a socially awkward space. He was not a noble, but he held the lord's authority. He was not a peasant, but he lived among them and directed their lives. This position as the middleman defined his relationships and his reputation. He was stuck between the hammer of the lord and the anvil of the village. His most important relationship was with his employer, the lord, and the lord's direct representative, the steward. The bailiff's entire career depended on keeping them happy. This meant one thing above all: profit. When the steward came for his annual visit, the bailiff had to present a detailed account of the manor's income and expenses. He had to justify every penny spent and account for every bushel of wheat produced. This created immense pressure. A bailiff who showed a growing profit was rewarded with job security and maybe a bonus. A bailiff who showed a loss, even if it was due to a bad harvest or cattle disease, would be under suspicion. Was he incompetent, or was he stealing? This fear of failure or accusation hung over him constantly. It drove him to push the peasants harder, to cut corners where he could, and to be strict in collecting every last fee and fine. He was always trying to make the numbers look good for his bosses. His relationship with the reeve was complex and vital. On paper, the bailiff was in charge. In reality, he couldn't do his job without the reeve's cooperation. The reeve was the one who knew everyone in the village. He knew who was a hard worker, who was a troublemaker, who was having a hard time because his wife was sick. The reeve knew the local soil and the quirks of the local weather in a way an outsider bailiff might not. A smart bailiff would form a working partnership with the reeve. They would meet every morning to plan the day's work. The bailiff would set the goals, and the reeve would figure out the best way to get the villagers to meet them. But there was always an underlying tension. The bailiff served the lord. The reeve, even though he was enforcing the lord's rules, ultimately had to live with the villagers after his term was up. If the bailiff demanded something unreasonable, like working the peasants during a church festival, the reeve would have to push back. Their relationship was a constant negotiation. This brings us to the bailiff's most difficult relationship, the one he had with the common people of the manor. To most peasants, the bailiff was the face of an often oppressive system. He was the one who told them what to do. He was the one who fined them for letting their animals stray into the lord's crops. He was the one who accused them in the manor court of not doing their labor duty properly. He was the one who collected the hated Heriot tax, where the family of a dead peasant had to give their best animal to the lord. The bailiff was rarely a popular man. Medieval literature and songs often portray him as a villain. He is seen as greedy, arrogant, and cruel. Chaucer, in the Canterbury Tales, describes a reeve who was a skilled manager, but he knew how to cheat his lord. Many bailiffs were likely seen in the same light. They were seen as outsiders who were there to extract as much wealth from the village as possible. Of course, the reality was probably more varied. There were likely fair and efficient bailiffs who were respected even if they weren't loved. A good bailiff knew that you couldn't run a manor into the ground. You needed the peasants to be healthy enough to work and have enough food to survive the winter. A bailiff who was too harsh might face a peasant revolt, or more likely, quiet resistance. While tools would mysteriously break, work would be done slowly and poorly, animals would wander off. The villagers had ways of fighting back. The potential for corruption was huge. A bailiff was in charge of all the manor's assets. It would be easy for him to skim a little off the top. He could sell some of the lord's grain and pocket the money. He could demand bribes from peasants in exchange for lighter work assignments. He could falsely accuse a peasant of an offense in the manor court just to collect the fine. The annual audit by the steward was meant to prevent this, but a clever bailiff could hide his tracks. The bailiff's own life was one of isolation. He might have a family, but they were also seen as separate from the village community. He wasn't invited to the peasant celebrations in the same way. He was the boss, and that set him apart. He was a man with a great deal of local power, but very little social connection. He was the lord's man in a peasant's world. While a bailiff needed to know about soil, crops, and animals, a big part of his job was actually administration. He was a record keeper and an accountant. The medieval manor was a business and it ran on paperwork. Without accurate records, the lord would have no idea if his property was profitable or if his manager was stealing from him. The most important documents a bailiff dealt with were the manorial accounts. At the end of each year, usually around Michaelmas in late September, the bailiff had to produce a full account for the steward. This was an incredibly detailed document, usually written on a long roll of parchment in Latin. A bailiff himself might not be fully literate, especially in Latin, but he was expected to be numerate. He would often work with a clerk, perhaps a local priest or a traveling professional, to drop the final accounts. These accounts were divided into sections. There was the charge, which was all the income. This included cash from rents, money from the sale of grain, hides or wool, and fees from the manor court and the mill. It also included everything produced on the manor, measured in kind. So many bushels of wheat, so many of barley, so many lambs born, so many chickens' eggs collected. Everything was counted. Then there was the discharge, which was all the expenses. This included the bailiff's own salary, wages for any hired help like a blacksmith or a carter, the cost of new tools, and expenses for repairing buildings. The account also had to show what happened to all the produce, how much grain was used for seed, how much was sent to the lord's main household, how much was used to feed the farm workers. At the end, you had the balance. This showed the clear profit or loss for the year. The steward would go through this document with a fine-toothed comb. He would question the bailiff on every entry. Why were the repair costs for the barn so high? Why was the price received for the wool so low? The bailiff had to have answers for everything. This annual audit was the most important day of the bailiff's year. It was his performance review, and his job was on the line. To keep track of things day to day, bailiffs used simpler methods. One of the most common was the tally stick. This was a brilliant low-tech accounting tool. A stick of wood, usually hazel, was marked with notches to represent a debt or a delivery. For example, if a peasant paid his rent of 5 shillings, the bailiff and the peasant would take a stick, and the bailiff would cut 5 notches for the shillings into it. Then, the stick was split in half lengthwise right through the notches. The bailiff kept one half, and the peasant kept the other. This was a foolproof receipt. Neither side could alter their stick without it being obvious, because the two halves wouldn't match up anymore. When it was time to settle accounts, they would bring their two halves together to make sure they tallied. This is where we get the expression to tally up. Tally sticks were used for everything from tracking rent payments to recording the amount of work a peasant had done. The bailiff also had a major role in the manor court. This was the local court for the village, usually held in the manor house or even outside under a large tree. The steward would act as the judge, but the bailiff acted as the prosecutor. It was his job to bring forward cases on behalf of the lord. He would report tenants who had not performed their labor duties. He would accuse people of trespassing on the lord's land or poaching rabbits from his woods. He would report disputes between villagers over land or animals. The court dealt with all the minor offenses and breaches of the manor's customs. People were fined for these offenses, and that money went to the lord. So, for the bailiff, the court was another source of income for the manor. He had a direct incentive to find and prosecute wrongdoing. This combination of duties shows that the bailiff had to be a multi-talented person. He couldn't just be a tough supervisor shouting at people in the fields. He had to have a head for numbers. He had to be organized. He had to understand the complex web of customs, rights, and obligations that governed the manor. He had to be able to present a case in court and defend his financial records to a skeptical steward. The image of a simple farm manager is incomplete. The medieval bailiff was also a bureaucrat and an accountant, using the tools of his time to manage a complex and valuable asset for his employer. The world of the medieval bailiff, with its strict control over land and labor, was not destined to last forever. Major historical forces, particularly disease and economic change, would eventually make his role obsolete. The bailiff didn't just disappear overnight, but his importance slowly faded as the manorial system itself transformed. The single biggest catalyst for change was the Black Death. The plague, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, killed a huge portion of the population. In some areas, a third to a half of the people died. This created a massive labor shortage. Suddenly, the old power dynamic was turned on its head. Lords were desperate for workers to farm their lands. Peasants, for the first time in centuries, had bargaining power. Surviving peasants could demand higher wages for their work. If one lord refused, they could simply leave and find another lord who would pay. The old system of serfdom, where peasants were tied to the land and forced to provide free labor, began to crumble. The lords tried to pass laws to freeze wages and stop peasants from moving, but these were largely unenforceable. There were simply not enough people to go around. This created a huge problem for the bailiff. His job was based on managing the lord's demesne using the forced labor of the peasants. With that labor force shrinking and demanding cash wages, the old way of doing things became incredibly expensive and inefficient. It was no longer profitable for a lord to directly farm his own land. In response, lords began to change their business model. Instead of farming the demesne themselves, they found it much easier and more reliable to rent it out. They would lease the entire demesne to a single wealthy peasant or a group of villagers for a fixed cash payment each year. This practice was called commutation. The lord was no longer in the business of producing grain, he was in the business of collecting rent. He became a landlord in the modern sense of the word. This shift had a profound impact on the bailiff. When the lord is just a landlord collecting cash, he no longer needs a hands-on, expert agricultural manager living on the estate. The day-to-day decisions about what to plant and when to harvest were now the responsibility of the tenant who was renting the land. The need for a bailiff to supervise plowing, manage livestock, and organize the harvest simply vanished. The bailiff's role was gradually replaced by other figures. The lord still needed someone to collect the rents, so the job evolved into that of a rent collector or a land agent. The powerful steward, who oversaw many manors, remained important for managing the lord's overall portfolio of properties. But the resident bailiff, the man on the ground, became a relic of an older economic system. His skills were no longer what the lord required. The word bailiff did not disappear, however. It survived, but its meaning shifted. It retained its association with legal authority and enforcement. The bailiff of the manor was the one who enforced the lord's rules and brought people before the manor court. As the centuries passed, the title bailiff became attached to officers of the public legal system. This is how we get the modern court bailiff, the person who maintains order in a courtroom. It's also how we get the bailiffs, or enforcement agents, who are empowered by a court to seize property to settle a debt. In both cases, the core idea from the medieval era remains a bailiff is a person with delegated authority who enforces the rules and carries out the will of a higher power, whether that power is a medieval lord or a modern court of law. Looking back, the medieval bailiff was a critical figure. He was not a king, a knight, or a bishop. He will never be the hero of a romantic story, but in many ways, he was more important to the daily functioning of society than many of them were. He was the gear that connected the wealth of the landowning elite to the labor of the peasantry. He was the on-site manager who made the entire manorial economy work. He was often unpopular, and he walked a fine line between serving his master and managing the people. But without him, the great castles and cathedrals of the Middle Ages might never have been built, because it was the profit he extracted from the land, bushel by bushel, that helped pay for it all.